guys think of FPV drones? What do you think of? I know what I think of. 30-second clips of a $500 Kamikaze drone running into a $2 million tank. Well, bam. But there's a lot more that goes into it, as you probably expect. In order to be self-sufficient, in order to not be relying just on NATO or just relying on these very state-of-the-art but expensive weapons, you have to be able to build and make these drones and fly them. There's a lot that goes into those 30-second clips. So I'm going to talk about it today because that's my job now. First of all, I want to mention that I am releasing merch. You can buy your own t-shirt with the Ukrainian flag, with the FPV drone flying through the air. I think it's pretty sick. We're going to have more designs in the future as well, but if you want to pick one up, feel free to do so. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, what kind of FPVs are there? There's more than Kamikaze, there's also bombers. You probably typically think of them just as Mavics because you can't really see the drone when they're dropping, but these are bomber FPVs a lot of times. They can carry 3 times the weight, but they're a third of the price. FPV bombers are everywhere. I've made a couple of them. FPVs are a bigger genre than you would probably think. Genre? I don't know. In order to fly the drone, you have to have, first of all, a lot of practice. All right, these things take practice. You got to be able to fly them, and it'll take a couple weeks to get really good. What do you need on position to fly these drones? Well, you need 2 different types of antennas. You need one for the video, okay? And then you need one for the radio. So you have 2 antennas sitting up there 20 meters away from your hole, and they're outside next to a tree on a tripod, sending out a signal on a frequency that you're able to fly your drone at. Now, these cables, you're gonna have like 4 of them leading all the way down to your hole. And you're sitting inside this hole, and you have your goggles on. This is how you see the drone fly. So you put on the goggles, and you have it connected to the video antenna. And then you have your controller. You have to be able to fly the drone. You can't fly without a controller. So you have another set of cables for the radio antenna leading to your controller. So that's that. And then you have to have a couple other parts. You have to have batteries. You have to have zip ties and a soldering kit on hand because stuff can get damaged in transportation, especially if you're moving around 50 of them and there's bumpy roads and maybe a little bit of artillery on the way there. It's gonna happen. And you gotta have a battery charging station. You gotta have a generator to charge the EcoFlow, which is like the battery, the big battery, to charge the small batteries. You know, it's the typical stuff for a hole. But there's one thing that I'm forgetting. Oh yeah, the FPVs. When we talk about the FPVs, you gotta have like 50 of them. If you're doing a Kamikaze mission, why? Because they're just so cost effective. How much would you spend to kill a Russian soldier? Oh man, I couldn't put a number to it. But guess what? FPVs are cheap. They're less than $1,000. You can make a Kamikaze drone for $200 if you really want. That's the reason that we use them so prevalently. There's no reason other than sleeping that you would not have an FPV drone in the air targeting something if you have a good production. Kamikaze is super useful. When it comes to bombers, you need a little bit less because you expect to be able to reuse them a couple times before jamming gets them or they're shot down or whatever happens. They run out of battery, you know, and this is what it takes to be self-sufficient. You got to have people who are in the back building these drones, programming them, all the stuff. And actually, I want to get into the nitty-gritty now a little bit. Let's get into what do you see on the drone. When you're looking at this drone, it's got 4 propellers, it's got 4 legs. You put a battery on top, okay? This is where you put the battery, and then on the bottom, you can strap ammunition. Maybe you need a dropping device that you then solder to the main CPU chip, and then you connect it to your laptop. You know, after a couple hours, you can figure out how to go and tell it to drop on this button on the controller. And you have to program everything to the controller. That's kind of how that works. There's different programs. And I'm not talking like 1 or 2. I'm talking like 5, 6 different programs you need to be capable on if you're the engineer. So it takes a while. But the good thing is that the FPV teams that are in Ukraine, at least, are so nice to each other. Everybody's just there to help. Everybody wants to support the other team and want to make them successful, which is so cool. It's a very inviting crew of people. Now, the next thing you're going to see on the drone are the receiver and the antenna. So this is the receiver. This is receiving the radio control. So when you press a button on your controller, it's going to receive it and then tell the drone to react in a certain way. And then you have the antenna, and this antenna is going to be sending out the video feed back to your antenna, into your goggles, and you have video feed. And when it comes to these antennas and the capabilities, the range, the battery, you can expect on an analog device, which we're gonna get into, 20 kilometers. It's actually pretty good. Now let's get into the front of the aircraft because I want to talk about some of the limitations and some of the weird things. All right, so we have 2 different types of video: digital and analog. Analog video is going to be very, very useful on the front line, especially Kamikazes. Why? Because they're cheap and they are also not super jammable. Yes, you can get jammed and you won't be able to see the video, but sometimes you'll be able to see a little bit and you'll still be able to fly and still be able to direct it towards your target. This is the majority of the Kamikaze footage that you see. And you can see that it's not the best video quality, especially if you're reaching out far. And then we have digital. And digital is really useful for recon drones like Mavics, which Mavics have, or maybe bomber drones. But the problem is that it doesn't decrease in quality. It never decreases in quality, it just cuts the video. So if the video cuts, you don't know where you're going anymore. Where analog, you'd be able to direct the aircraft. Because usually the video is going to be the first thing to cut. The radio signal is pretty good. But the video, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of information you're putting through this frequency. It really is. In digital cameras, they're a lot sharper. You know, you can zoom in sometimes. So that's kind of another small thing, just so you guys know. You know, there's two different types of video. So when it comes to the antenna, the goggles, and pretty much everything else on your drone workshop, it all depends on what video you have. You have to have a set of goggles and antennas for each different type of video. So you have to have one for analog and digital. They do not work vice versa, usually. You have to have multiple sets of each thing in order to develop yourself in the FPV community. You want to be able to fly both ways for different missions. You got to find a frequency as well. So that's pretty much all you need to know for that. Then we had to talk about the controller. And there's a lot of different types of controllers. You have TX12s, you have TX16S, Boxers, you have all sorts of different ones. And you gotta be able to fly in each one. Sometimes if you switch the controller, you won't be able to understand where the switches are, so you need a lot of practice, a lot of flight time, and you gotta be able to, hit your target. You don't wanna disarm midair. These things are dangerous. These are all self-made. You're kind of like making an IED, a flying IED. Think of it that way. You have to be able to rig bombs as well and understand how detonators work in C4, plastic explosive, all sorts of different explosives, and you gotta be able to fit it all together. You have to understand how to ground something, and everybody in the team needs to know how to do each of these things, because if you don't, you're gonna get yourself killed or hurt really, really bad. There's a lot of cases of that, unfortunately. The accidents happen, but wow. So that's kind of what you're looking at when it comes to a Kamikaze. And then there's the bomber drone, and the bomber drone, oh my god. Yeah, you have to have a dropping device and program it online, and then you have to have a camera swivel, or maybe two cameras. Either way, you have to program it, and you have to make sure you can look down and you can see your target when you're bombing. There's just a lot more moving parts, literally, when it comes to bomber drones that they're very difficult to produce and they're very difficult to get really good at, I suppose. But it is possible, and I've seen it very effective. And then you have to have bombs. Wow, who would have thought? You gotta have all sorts of different bombs for different missions. If you're hitting a bill and dodge, maybe you don't want to use shrapnel. Maybe you want to use something just bigger, explosive, concussive, thermobaric. You want to use different munitions for different reasons. You guys can probably see in the videos like how much goes into this. It took us, oh god, like a solid week to get 5 bomber drones ready for the front line. And then when we brought it to the front line, there's a bunch of different things that happen. There's a bad frequency, we have to use a different one. So now we need to replace all the antennas and receivers, like everything, in order to make it so that it can run on this different frequency. That's what goes into it. And each front line, each part of the front line has a different frequency that works best. So that's why it's so important that the FPV teams communicate with each other, and you can find out what frequency that they're running on, so you don't like jam their video signal, and you can get like 2 signals on your screen if you're on the same one. There's all these invisible waves in the air that you have to keep an eye on, and the best way is just to talk to these teams and know what is in our area, so this way I don't like interfere with you. There's so many drones in the battlefield, so many radio frequencies being used and jamming systems that you have to go with the flow. It's kind of like a vibe when you're flying. You gotta figure out where the jamming is, and you gotta figure out what frequency works best. Should it go on 2.8 or 5.6 and all this stuff, and it's very complicated. It is. And it's all invisible. It's just numbers. A lot of programming. And that's engineering. There's soldering you have to do. You have to understand wiring. You have to understand UARTs. I don't even know what that means, but I've soldered a lot of things onto UARTs before. And then you have to understand the software side as well. So you have to be able to understand the 6, 7 different programs in order to bind the drone, make it so that it connects to the radio. Oh, it's a hassle. That's going to be your first week of engineering, is just figuring out how to bind, which is like the simplest thing. You gotta have the same frequency. You have to download different driver updates and different, oh man, I don't like it. I don't enjoy that part. I'm still not even good at it. I'm better at just being a solder monkey, just doing stuff, I'm not good at this stuff that takes any thought. My IQ isn't good. On the bomber drones, sometimes you're gonna put GPS units, and these GPS units can help it self-stabilize, so that way you can get a clearer and better picture of your target. Drop it on it, should be more effective. But that's another part that needs to be programmed, soldered on, engineered, and you have to auto-tune it as well. So you have to take it to the range, set everything up in a safe environment, and go out for a nice flight, figure out if everything's good. There was one time we had everything working. We went out to the field, and for like 2 days we were wondering, why can't we go over a kilometer with this thing? And it turns out we had some weird regulatory thing inside our digital camera which there's so many different parts, digital cameras and cameras that you can use. But on our specific one, they made it so that there's a regulatory domain on it that made it so that you will be limited if you fly beyond a kilometer. We didn't know that until we looked at the right page on Reddit, and then we were able to buy an SD card to go and plug into that thing and then change the regulatory domain, which we had to find online on some weird FPV website, and then it worked. And then we get to the Frontline, it gets jammed because there's different frequencies. So now we have to change all the frequency and the antennas and change the receivers, and yeah, I mean it's a lot, and that's what goes into these things. It takes a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and hot rooms full of bugs, especially the spiders when they make homes out of your goggles. Gross. So I've talked about what's inside the drone. I've talked about the different types of drones. I've talked about all these different things, the different things that you run into, the problems. And now the last thing, but most of the time the first thing you need, is funding. Who is going to fund you? Luckily, the FPV world is very welcoming, and they're going to be there to help you. Sometimes inter-unit, they're starting to develop it in the Ukrainian military at least. They're going to have FPV teams and big battalion FPV cells that are going to have everything that you need. Soldering kits and engineers who can help guide you in the right way, and maybe people who are just making these drones and receiving them. Maybe there's an NGO. There's a lot of battalions now have an NGO person, somebody who reaches out to NGOs and says, we have an FPV team and we need support. So a lot of NGOs, a lot of people that are willing to help Ukraine in this way, super important. You guys support our FPV team by watching my videos, by donating or buying these t-shirts. There's a lot of different ways to support. I think the worst thing that people run into in the FPV community is that if you don't have a big name and test your unit or whatever it is, I think that's the biggest thing that foreigners can bring is just somebody who has somewhat of a following or has this money coming in from Western nations that have a little bit more cash on hand. So when these Ukrainians that are very good engineers, that are the best, they've been doing this for 2 years, don't have funding because they put their bank card or their PayPal on their Instagram and because they don't have like a following, it's really sad to see. If you ever want to find an FPV team to help, you can probably find it pretty quick. So anyway, that's pretty much all I want to say. Just want to give you guys a better insight into how to make these FPVs fly and what goes into these cool footages that you will be seeing on my channel very soon, hopefully. Thanks again to everybody who's bought a t-shirt. Thanks to the members. You guys will be getting a huge discount on these t-shirts, as much as I can literally do. Just really appreciate you guys. You guys have helped me a lot to buy all sorts of different FPV equipment and stuff that we need. These support roles are all about saving the infantry lives. How can we do that? Well, this is one way. You guys are directly helping. Thank you again. I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Peace.